Hello, I'm Alex Palanak and I'm Head of Sanctuary at the University of Leicester. Welcome to this presentation, which is the second of a series of 4 videos which forms part of a set of training materials on the topic of working with trauma in the Refugee Language Classroom. This Part 2 video focuses on trauma mitigation strategies. In this Part 2 video, I will explore why we should adapt our teaching to accommodate trauma, and then go on to outline useful strategies for mitigating the effects of trauma. And then I'll introduce 3 case studies to apply these strategies to. So why should we adapt our teaching to accommodate trauma? Well, the main reason for this relates to the idea of inclusion. And as you can see from this quotation here, inclusion is a process of addressing and responding to the diversity of needs of learners through increasing participation, reducing exclusion. It involves changes and modifications in content, approaches, structures, and strategies, and a conviction that it's the responsibility of the system to do this. So this principle has been adopted by many educational institutions over the last few years. It's important to note that this way of thinking about inclusion rejects the deficit-focused medical model of disability and learning difficulties, because that way of thinking about disability put the responsibility on the student to change, to fit into the existing educational system, or to fail. Instead, this way of thinking about inclusion takes an interactional view, where barriers to learning are seen as a result of a combination of an individual's learning difficulties and special needs, plus the different educational, social, and linguistic contexts or environments that they're in. So this way of thinking about disability, which might also be called neurodivergence, puts the responsibility on teachers and the educational system to change their structures and processes to ensure that all students can learn to their full potential. So we can see how modifying our practices to include neurodivergent students may help those students, but we might ask, what about my other students? Well, the good news is that the inclusive classroom practices have been shown to benefit all students, not only those who are neurodivergent. Okay, so what can we do to mitigate the effects of trauma in the language classroom? So one thing which we can do is to help students reduce some of their post-migration stresses. This can relate to practical daily struggles such as grappling with the asylum system or homelessness. It's difficult for students to focus on future-oriented activity like learning when they have these sorts of practical struggles to deal with day to day. But actually, the language classroom is a good place to be able to help students with some of these things. We can help students with language for their daily needs, such as phrases for talking to the doctor or their solicitor. Also, referring students to suitable agencies in situations such as if a person is made homeless when they gain refugee status. This would involve knowing how and where to refer students to for support and not taking on too much ourselves. So helping them in these sorts of ways with practical difficulties could really help to lower their stress levels in class. Also, being understanding of reasons for lateness or absence. So that relates back to what Kirka said on a previous slide about having a basic understanding of student situations and the ways in which these might affect students' engagement with their courses, which can help us be open to responding more appropriately and flexibly in these situations. A really important tenet of trauma-informed pedagogy relates to creating a safe space. This is an important way in which we can reduce students' anxiety. It's useful to note that for some trauma survivors, the classroom might be the only safe space that they experience. So here are a few suggestions as to what we can do to try to create this safe space. Some of these things we do quite often and quite naturally in the language classroom. For example, we tend to give people lots of opportunities to work with others and to create a classroom environment which promotes cooperation and support. We tend to make sure that the physical space is safe and welcoming. We tend to do sensitive error correction and to give people clear ground rules and boundaries. Things like clear ground rules and boundaries are very important for trauma survivors, as these can help people feel like there is some sort of structure. They know what to expect, which can help to reduce anxiety levels. This also applies to providing a sense of routine and structure to our lessons and our courses as a whole. This might involve doing a similar sort of activity at the beginning and end of each lesson, setting activities up in a similar sort of way, having clear expectations related to homework and things like that. These things can all help people feel like they have some control over what is happening. On the topic of control, another good way to help students have a sense of this is to give them the choice of opting out of activities if they ever need or want to. It is healthy for trauma survivors to know in advance that they do have options. This can also help reduce anxiety levels. Things like confidentiality are of course very important for all students. You could argue more so for trauma survivors. This relates to not outing people as a refugee, especially in mixed classes of refugees and non-refugees. So giving people that control and that choice in terms of how much they choose to share with the other students in the class. Also, things like not putting people on the spot. Actually, in ELT, nomination is something that we do quite a lot, picking individual students to answer certain questions in open class. However, the point has been made that for some people who have survived interrogation and torture, being put on the spot to answer a question or talk on a certain topic might be triggering. That said, once we get to know our students and build a positive relationship with them and a good sense of community in the class as a whole, we can start to get a sense of what students are comfortable with, following their lead in some ways and being responsive and flexible to their emerging needs. Bearing in mind the importance of developing good relationships before a student might feel safe, I would personally take extra care with things like getting to know you activities which take place right at the beginning of a new course. These sorts of activities often ask students to pose and answer very direct personal questions, so it would be advisable to design these activities to be open and offer more choices where possible. Not forcing personalization is another really important one, and actually this is one area in which trauma-informed pedagogy and regular practice in ELT diverge from each other quite a bit. So in ELT, in the humanistic and communicative approaches, personalization is generally encouraged because it is generally seen to promote higher levels of motivation, as well as engagement and retention of information. But for trauma survivors, this may not be appropriate because it may be triggering for people to feel like they have to share and potentially relive traumatic experiences. Potentially triggering topics might include talking about their families who may have died or be trapped in dangerous situations, or talking about their childhood, or talking about a journey which might remind them of a perilous journey to a country of relative safety. So we need to be very careful with these sorts of topics. On the other hand, it would be doing the students a disservice to avoid these topics completely, as they do need to develop the language to talk about these things, not least when talking to officials about their asylum case, or when taking an official English language exam, which don't tend to screen topics which might be triggering for trauma survivors. So it's important for us to find a way to tackle these topics sensitively and carefully. One way to approach this would be to encourage people to use the third person rather than talking in the first person. We could say, okay, we're going to talk today about journeys. You can talk if you want about a journey that you have made, or a journey that somebody you know has made, or perhaps you could offer a fictional situation that they could talk about, perhaps based on a picture prompt. But the key here is to give people choice so that they never feel forced to talk about themselves or anything that they might feel uncomfortable talking about. This relates to the idea of sharing as much or as little as they wish, and giving control and agency back to the student, rather than them feeling like they have to share things that they really don't want to share. Another thing which we can do in the classroom is to help reduce trauma symptoms. One way to do this is through grounding activities, which can help bring students into the present, into the classroom, into their bodies. This could be, for example, through multisensory games, movement, rhythm, jazz chants, things which really ground them and help them feel that they are physically in the classroom. Another thing to mention here relates to treading carefully around likely trauma triggers. We've touched upon this briefly already, but it's important to stress here that there are certain things which are more likely to be triggering for people who have a refugee background, things like families, journeys, and talking about one's childhood. But it's really important to remember that actually trauma triggers could potentially be anything. The tone of voice that someone uses, a certain sound or smell or colour. So we can't reliably predict every single thing which might be triggering for each individual student. Once we have adjusted for the more obvious potential trauma triggers, the best we can do here is to be vigilant and flexible and responsive to what's going on around us, always ready to make adjustments based on how our students are responding. Another thing which we can do is to incorporate small regular goals and progress checks. This can be helpful because trauma survivors often find it difficult to see incremental progress in their learning and development. Many trauma survivors have a sort of all or nothing mentality, seeing the world in terms of extremes. So one thing that we can usefully do to mitigate this is to set these small regular goals and progress checks. This can help them see that actually they are improving, and again it helps to ground them in what's actually happening. Another thing to mention here is that many trauma survivors find it difficult to set goals because trauma can block the imagination and can stop people from being able to imagine what the future might be like or how to act to change things. So again, that's another reason why these small achievable goals are very helpful to help to gradually unblock that. In terms of mental health first aid strategies, I'm sure you've come across these before, and there are a few different versions which have been developed, but I'm just going to show you one example of a trauma de-escalation strategy on the next slide. Here's one example of what you might do if a student is having a flashback or a panic attack. So you can start by focusing on yourself, taking deep breaths and making sure that you're calm as the person who's getting ready to help. Then you can move on to make gradual contact with the student, starting with eye contact and slow, calm movements, while giving them plenty of space and being careful not to alarm them. And then gently starting to reorient them, saying their name, telling them they're safe, reminding them of the date and who you are. And then, if you need to, you can then create a stronger sensory stimulus, speaking more loudly, letting them know you're going to touch them on the arm if appropriate, again, so you don't alarm them. And when they seem to be back in the present moment, you can start explaining what happened to them, letting them know they're safe, asking them if they need a bit of time out or perhaps a drink or a snack. And then privately, you might like to ask them if they'd like a chance to talk to the class about what happened, if you think that this is appropriate. This is kind of acknowledging that if this has happened in a social space, other students might also be alarmed or upset by what happened. So this is one possible way of mitigating that. And then finally, it's important not to neglect practitioner self-care, as practitioners can suffer from something called compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma, which is characterized by physically, mentally, or emotionally feeling overwhelmed or exhausted by somebody else's trauma. But there are various steps that we can take to prevent this. As I mentioned earlier, referral is important, knowing when and how to refer people to appropriate support services. In terms of boundaries, this can refer to things like your time, your role and activities, and also emotional boundaries, including the question of how to show empathy without over-identifying with a student to the detriment of your own well-being. This is something that each person needs to think about in terms of what is appropriate in their situation and what they feel comfortable with. In terms of self-care, this relates to activities which are nurturing and good for your own sense of well-being. These are different for different people, but might include things like yoga, spending time in nature, or doing something fun. In terms of peer support, you might want to buddy up with a colleague to talk about difficult experiences or challenges in the classroom. And reflection is another important one. Some people find that keeping a journal or talking with colleagues can help them process the situation and think about appropriate next steps. It's important to note here that the responsibility for providing practitioner self-care and care and support for students should not all fall upon the practitioner. Institutions have an important role to play here too, in terms of setting up systems and processes which facilitate things like peer support, referral of students to appropriate services, and the maintaining of healthy boundaries. Here's the list of references related to this Part 2 presentation. If you're interested in reading more around this topic, I'd recommend Jenny Horsman for supporting women who have experienced trauma, and Stadler here for approaches to inclusion. We've now reached the end of the Part 2 video on the topic of working with trauma in the Refugee Language Classroom. I'd encourage you to now go back to the self-access materials and take a look at Task 5, which will help you reflect on the main principles for mitigating the effects of trauma in the ESOL classroom, and will offer 3 case studies for you to consider in terms of how you might apply trauma-informed strategies to each situation.